So chapter 24 from Job and the part about the city comes in verse 12. And Job asks a question in verse 1 to begin. Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days? There are those who move boundary stones. They pasture flocks they have stolen. They drive away the orphan's donkey and take the widow's ox in pledge. They thrust the needy from the path and force all the poor of the land into hiding. Like wild donkeys in the desert, the poor go about their labor of foraging food. The wasteland provides food for the children. They gather fodder in the fields and glean in the vineyards of the wicked. Lacking clothes, they spend the night naked. They have nothing to cover themselves in the cold. They are drenched by mountain rains and hug the rocks for lack of shelter. The fatherless child is snatched from the breast. The infant of the poor is seized for a debt. Lacking clothes, they go about naked. They carry sheaves, but still go hungry. They crush olives among the terraces. They tread wine presses, yet suffer thirst. The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help. But God charges no one with wrongdoing. There are those who rebel against the light, who do not know its ways or stay in its paths. When daylight is gone, the murderer rises up, kills the poor and needy, and in the night steals forth like a thief. The eye of the adulterer watches for dusk. He thinks, no eye will see me. He keeps his face concealed. In the dark, thieves break into houses, but by day they shut themselves in. They want nothing to do with the light. For all of them, the midnight is their morning. They make friends with the terrors of darkness. Yet they are foam on the surface of the water. Their portion of the land is cursed, so that no one goes to the vineyards. As heat and drought snatch away the melted snow, so the grave snatches away those who have sinned. The womb forgets them. The worm feasts on them. The wicked are no longer remembered, but are broken like a tree. They prey on the barren and childless woman, and to the widow they show no kindness. But God drags away the mighty by his power. Though they become established, they have no assurance of life. He may let them rest in a feeling of security, but his eyes are on their ways. For a little while they are exalted, and then they are gone. They are brought low and gathered up like all others. They are cut off like heads of grain. If this is not so, who can prove me false and reduce my words to nothing? Hard words from the book of Job. A couple weeks ago in the news, the leader of the biggest, baddest drug cartel in the world, his nickname El Chapo, got caught. And he got caught partly because the authorities were persistent, but he got caught mostly because their big break was him getting in touch with Hollywood because he wanted to have them make a movie about his life. And so because he wanted Hollywood fame in addition to the boatloads of money and power and notoriety that he already had, the authorities were able to zero in on his location and get him. And this is a classic example, El Chapo, of the Proverbs. Proverbs like, pride goes before destruction. You see that those who are destructive eventually self-destruct. A good example of the Proverbs. But in this chapter and in the book of Job, it shows the other part of the story, because you can think about all those whose lives were ruined by the drug cartel that El Chapo led, of those whose lives were ruined by murder and addiction and violence and trafficking and every other kind of evil that lies in the wake of an operation like that. And Job turns our attention towards those whose lives lie in ruin because of the wicked and the powerful. What about them, he asks, and he gives us a vivid description of their lives and what it's like, and wonders, where is God for them? Is hope real for them? It begins with that question. Why are the times, if there are times set for judgment, why can't we see when they are? Why can't we see when justice will happen? Because he sees the ruin of lives in struggle. And so Job helps us to see that picture clearly, to turn our gaze towards this uncomfortable picture of incredible injustice. And he asks, is God going to do anything about it? That's the question in the text. Is God going to do anything? Well, most of this book of Job is concerned with Job's specific situation. Most of you know the story of Job, how he lost it all. And then his friends came to comfort him, and they had this long discussion about his suffering. But in this chapter, Job turns his attention away from his own situation and his own suffering, and he turns his gaze and our gaze with him towards the suffering of the world around him and of the city. We hear that in verse 12 of the groans that rise from the dying in the city and of the souls of the wounded who lie there. What about them? Job turns our gaze towards them. And to understand this chapter, we have to see the different parts of the chapter. And we don't just need to see these different parts. What Job's aiming for and what we need to have is a feeling of the tension of these parts of the chapter. So let's think about that a little bit. Think about the tension Job creates with these parts of the chapter. And the first part of the chapter is verse 1, which is the question. If the Almighty has set times for judgment, how come those who are faithful to Him can't see it? I want to see when justice is going to happen, God. You're a God of justice. I see the world that's full of injustice. And so what gives? God rules as a God of justice, but we see a world full of injustice, and that's the tension in the text. How to resolve that tension? This is the question in verse 1 that governs the whole chapter and establishes the tension between a world ruled by a just God and a world that's full of injustice. Then there's a second section to the chapter, verses 2 through 12, that describes the suffering of the vulnerable and the weak. All the things they face. It's sort of the worst possible situation for them in verse after verse. And then in the next part of the chapter, verses 13 to 17, Job describes those who abuse the vulnerable. He describes the criminality of the criminals. And then in the last part, verses 18 to 24, he describes what he would like to see. Justice as he would like to see it, given by God. Here's what I want, God. Not that he sees that, but this is what he wants. And then he finishes in verse 25 with a challenge. He says, if this isn't true, show me where I'm wrong. And really throws down the gauntlet for God to show up and answer his question. And so Job's his idea here, his intent, is to create an unbearable amount of tension, an intolerable amount of tension between what we want and what we see and what we wonder about with this question, and so to make it so intolerable that God himself is compelled to come and answer Job's question, is compelled to come and do justice and show up and tell Job, when is the time for justice? And Job creates tension throughout this entire chapter in order that we feel this struggle between a God of justice and a world full of injustice. Now, in the interest of creating some tension in this passage, in this message, some bungee cords. Bungee cords are for tension, right? So we are going to look at the parts of this scripture and try to feel the tension that is in this text, beginning with the first part. And so much of this passage is, I think, familiar in the 21st century as well. I mean, some of the specific descriptions are, from thousands of years ago, but the problem at heart is really the same, the struggles that people have. And so the first few verses, verses 2 through 4, describe something in the first half of the verse that's bad, and then something in the second half of the verse that's worse. And so Job says there are those who move boundary stones. So people use stones to mark off the boundary of their field. And you could sort of be passive-aggressive towards your neighbor to expand your own field by sort of moving the boundary stone a little further over so that your field is bigger and his field is smaller. This was a way to sort of steal some of your neighbor's field in this passive-aggressive way. So that's bad, but it's even worse, as Job says in verse 2, to take flocks by stealing them. So it's bad to move boundary stones, but it's even worse to steal your neighbor's flocks. So this is one way that Job creates some tension in the text, from bad to worse. And then he describes another thing that goes from bad to worse. They steal an orphan's donkey. They chase away an orphan's donkey. So that's bad. They have to go find it again. But it's even worse to take a widow's ox in pledge. Oxes were more expensive than donkeys, and they've taken it. It's blatantly worse than just chasing it off. And so that's another thing that goes from bad to worse, creating tension in the text. And then there's the third one in verse 4, where they thrust the needy from the path. So that's bad because they've run them off the road. But it's even worse to send people not just off the path, but into hiding. It goes from bad to worse, and Job ratchets up the tension in the text by showing us these terrible things. But then it gets worse yet in the next few verses, because it's not just that people get disrespected as human beings, they also get abused as if they aren't even human beings. And so he describes the wild donkey foraging in the desert, and that this is what real people have been reduced to doing, that they've become almost like having to be like wild animals, foraging in the wilderness and exposed to bad weather and lacking even the most basic things that they need for shelter. And so there they are, naked in the cold and trying to find shelter up against a rock and struggling to find food and just being treated in every way possible like they're not even human beings. Job pulls the tension tighter. Their families get broken up because they can't pay debts. There's insult to injury that they do find work. They're harvesting someone's fields, but they're so poor that they can't even buy the food that they're carrying in from the field. So they have to look at it while they're harvesting the food and working, knowing that they can't purchase it even though they're hungry. Or they tread the grapes in the winepress, and you see the juice beneath them, and they're thirsty, but they can't drink it. They don't have money to pay for it. This is how they suffer. And as I said, I think some of these things are familiar to us 4,000 years later. I can't help but think of our homeless neighbors in the rain and in the chilly weather, like it describes in this passage, how they struggle to make their lives come together in bad weather, out in the elements. Or I was reading just yesterday in the newspaper about the Ebola epidemic. You remember this perhaps from a year ago, that there was this terrible disease that afflicted people mostly in Western Africa. So the article was about Ebola, but it was about a year later. All the people who had made it and what their lives were like as they tried to keep the pieces together. And one of the particular stories was about this woman who had lost her sister. But it wasn't just that she lost her sister, it was that her sister's children were now her responsibility. And so she had to take care of twice the kids, hers and her sister's, with half the help because her sister had died of Ebola. And this is the case for many people who had lost loved ones and family because of that epidemic. And so the newspaper article was about the struggles of the people a year later to keep their lives together after having lost so many loved ones. So I think of that story when I hear this chapter. Or I think of people who I know and love who have faced abuse. People who I know and love who have struggled against making ends meet. Kids that I have known personally who struggled each day with survival, let alone with trying to do well in school, because how chaotic their lives were at home, because their parents were absent or addicted or homeless or some other thing. And how are they going to make it when they're only trying to survive? And so the things that Job describes, I think, are real 4,000 years later as real issues. And so the cry rises up from the city, the groans of the dying and the struggling, but Job feels like God is absent to those cries. And verse 12 takes us back to the question that governs the text. Job wants to know, when's the day of justice going to come? And verse 12 says, but no one seems to get charged with wrongdoing. When is the day of justice going to come when people get charged for the wrongdoing they committed? But Job continues to turn up the tension in the text. Verses 13 through 17 describes something even worse. It describes the wrongdoers who afflict those who are struggling, and the way that they seem to get away with their lies and their evil, that for them light is darkness and midnight is morning and wrong is right and fear is their friend. And they terrorize the populace. Darkness is their light. And Job wonders how they can get away with it. He feels that tension of the criminals whose criminality is unpunished. And then it gets worse yet, because all of these words and descriptions that Job has chosen to describe are words that aggravate, precisely because they are things that God has previously commanded against. So, for example, we talked about the boundary stones, and it was the case in the scriptures that God commands against moving a boundary stone. And God has a command in the law about what you could take or not take, especially from a widow if she owed money. There was commands about providing food for people in the field so that they could glean. There were commands, of course, against murder and theft and adultery, and that's the criminality that Job describes people getting away with. And so the fact that Job has mentioned all these things that are also commanded in the law aggravates the rawness of the situation. Because he says, God, you commanded these things. Are you going to enforce them? God, you said that you would be the protector of the weak. You said that you would provide for the needy. You said that you would watch over them, the orphan and the widow. But this is what I see. And so, as I said, all the verses here have an allusion to some sort of law in Scripture that Job sees going unenforced. It increases the tension so that it feels intolerable, so that we wonder, is it ever going to be resolved? Will there be a day of justice? It's not just tense, it's also raw. And then Job finishes by saying, like, what he'd really like, right? What he'd really like to happen against the wicked, against all those whose evidence he's brought forward, is in verses 18 to 24. And it's sort of like Job's answer to question number 1. And if he says, what are the times of justice? 18 to 24 says, here's the justice I'd like to see, of the wicked being like foam, the wicked being like snow melted away, that there is no substance to them. Increase the tension there. That he wishes there be no substance to them, that the gains that they get from the evil that they do would simply be temporary and not lasting, not into life beyond death. And he expresses his frustration as it boils over against the situation of the suffering and against the criminality of the criminals. When will justice happen? 18 to 24 describes what he wishes he could see. And then the very last verse is the challenge. The last verse sums up the tension here. It kind of gathers up all that tension into one verse that acts almost like a dare against God, where he says, God, I dare you to come down and do something. I dare you to answer my question. I've made the tension so tight in this chapter, in my words, that now I am compelling you to set the time for justice. I am daring you to see what really happens in the world. I am daring you to come down and tell me if I'm wrong. Show me. Just throws down the gauntlet. Now, the amazing thing in this chapter is that Job does not simply despair. The amazing thing is that Job, the closer he gets to seeing the suffering and being affected by it in the world, the more he hangs on all the tighter to the idea that there has to be justice in the world. You'd think that seeing all this injustice in the world would just make Job say, well, forget it. I despair. There's no way this is going to turn out. But instead, it's the other way, that Job, the closer he sees the injustice of the world, the tighter he hangs on to the idea that there has to be a God who will come in justice and act someday, even if he can't see it. He cannot let go of the idea that there has to be an expression of justice someday, but he doesn't know when it is. It takes us back to the question in verse 1, when's it going to be? This is what I see. Here is how it goes. Here's what I'd like. But when's it going to be, God? Am I wrong? God, would you make hope real in the world with justice? You are a God of justice. There is a world full of injustice. When is the time set for judgment? That's the question and the tension that Job builds up in the text. And the closer he gets to the injustice, the more he wants justice. Sometimes when I'm driving my kids to school, I go down the road over here, and I see the dumpsters lined up against the road for the trash man. And sometimes when I'm driving down the road, I see people dumpster diving. They're homeless people or whatever, in the dumpsters, finding things that they might be able to sell or keep that they find useful. And whenever I see these people dumpster diving on the way to take my kids to school in the morning, it reminds me of a place that I was on the other side of the world at a very large dump in Manila in the Philippines. I think I've spoken before about how I visited the Philippines 10 years or so ago. And one of the places that we went to with our missionary friends was this huge dump in Manila. And this is sort of an infamous dump because, 15 years or so ago, there was this huge rainstorm, and there was like what you'd maybe describe as a landslide, but actually it was more like a garbage slide that slid into people's homes that were built up all around this dump. And a lot of people got buried, and they died in terrible fashion from this garbage slide after this rainstorm. So they made a bunch of changes about where you could build your house around there. But still, it was kind of a tragic place. But it's still there and still, accumulating trash. So we went there to visit, not just because we wanted to see the dump. We had other reasons too. But I remember vividly this trip because as we walked down this alleyway that's built up with houses and kind of has all these trees. It's almost like you're in a tunnel. You walk down that sidewalk in this alleyway, and not the aroma, but the odor of the dump grows stronger with like every step that you go down closer towards where it is. And then you stand there like in the sunshine and the heat and the humidity and the smell, and you see this huge dump and people like picking through. And so that's the part I remember that reminds me every time I see the dumpsters around here of this place and in this situation on the other side of the world in this massive dump. So So I thought about that. But that's the one thing that I remember vividly, this situation in this slum where people are just barely making it, trying to pick through the trash. This text kind of made me think about that. But this other idea from Job about the closer he gets to injustice, the more he desires justice, reminds me of another part of that day, that trip. Because right near that dump, our missionary friends took us to a little church that was there in that part of the city, not very far away from the dump. And I remember it vividly because there were some guys there who had a couple of old guitars, and we sat around at the church, and we played some music together. And then after chatting for a little while, we sort of had an impromptu church service. People gave testimonies, and we prayed prayers, and we sang songs. And I had discovered with these friends of mine, who I'd made that day, that we knew some of the same songs, even though we came from other parts of the world and didn't always, their English was pretty good. And so we discovered that we knew some of the same songs. So we played some of those songs, and we played a song that I had never really cared for, but now I can never hear it without remembering them, those guys who lived in the shadow and within the smell of the dump at this little church. And the song was Trading My Sorrows. I'm trading my sorrows. I'm trading my shame. I'm laying it down for the joy of the Lord. I'm trading my sickness. I'm trading my pain. I'm laying it down for the joy of the Lord. And it always impressed me that that's the song we sang there in the shadow of that dump with the smell coming in if the wind was blowing from the wrong direction, that these, my friends who lived in this slum, would sing, I'm trading my sorrows for the joy of the Lord. And that it takes real faith to sing that song when you're in a situation of struggle like that, to believe that God makes hope real. It feels to me cheap to sing that song as someone who lives a very comfortable middle-class life in America. But they inspire me when I hear that song, trading my sorrows for the joy of the Lord. That they are closer to sorrow, but they are also people of hope and faith and love. Justice of God, joy of God. It's like this miracle of faith for them to sing that song. Still, we can wonder, how does it come? When does it come? What are the days God has appointed for justice, that we might feel joy instead of sorrow? And there are 2 days that are appointed for justice, that God has specially appointed. One of those days is the last day, the very last day when Jesus comes again and judges the world. That's one of the days God has specially appointed for justice. But the other day that was appointed for justice happened 2,000 years ago on a Roman cross. That on the day when Jesus hung on the cross, Jesus entangled himself in the worst of human suffering, sin, and agony. That he joined us, entangled himself with us on the cross in the worst way that he could have, so that those who suffer would know that God would go to any length of suffering in order to make hope real. God entangles himself in our suffering, that we would know the extent of his love. But then also this suffering of Jesus on the cross, this was the most unfair thing that ever happened in the world. That the innocent one would be condemned to suffer and die. And the groan of Jesus' dying breath that rose from that city in Jerusalem was in order to heal the wounds, heal the souls wounded who cried out for help. And God charged Jesus with wrongdoing. It was a day of justice, but it was a day of justice against Jesus instead of against us. And so before that last and greatest day of judgment, on the very last day, there was an earlier day of justice against Jesus, so that we could, on the last day, face the judge who is also our Savior. And Jesus has promised that there is no evil that he cannot redeem. Job couldn't see that yet. When Job looked at the world, he wondered, how will God ever make hope real? And he ratchets up the tension, saying, when will it be, God? Job could not yet see the way that Jesus would be the answer to the question. Job could not yet see the way that the cross would be the resolution of the tension. Job could not yet see Jesus. We have the privilege to see how the cross is both God's entanglement in the world and also the solution to all of our entanglements in sin and suffering. It's the privilege we have to see the gospel in the light of the truth and know that earth has no sorrow, that heaven can't heal. But it's the cross that makes it possible. Now, as we finish this message, as we think about a little bit of application, I want to point out two things. The first thing is that there is an urgency about entanglement in this passage. That this text is important for us to hear because it helps us to feel that painful tension, that urgency about suffering in the world, because it is so easy to forget and to ignore those cries. But if we are people whose lives are defined by the cross, then we cannot be people who simply live in comfort and avoid entanglement with the suffering of the world, with the struggles of the people in our city. Jesus didn't avoid entanglement when he saw us in need. And so likewise, with his love in our heart and his cross defining us, we cannot be people who simply avoid entanglement. Jesus sends us out into the world in order to become entangled in it, in a sense, to love people where they're at and in their suffering. And so Job's words should renew in us a real sense of urgency, of vividness for the needs of our city. But the second half of that is that we have a cure for the entanglement. The second part is that as people of the cross, we shouldn't fear being entangled in the suffering people face, because it's precisely our faith in the cross that it's the only thing that can untangle the needs and suffering of the world. And so this is not a cure we should keep to ourselves. We believe with confidence that the cross is the cure. And so we can become, in a sense, entangled in the world and its need, knowing that we have with us the cure. We have with us the solution, the only knife that can cut through the tension. The cross is both Jesus' entanglement as well as Jesus' solution to the entanglement of suffering. And so that sends us into the world, not without confidence. It sends us into the world knowing we have the cure. Now, I know that for myself and for you, we often wonder, well, how? How are we going to do that? And as a small way to describe how we can do that in this very city, I offer to you the part 2 of my conversation with Chrissy Padilla-Berkey, these videos that I have of these interviews, this conversation, in order to know better how we can interact and be a blessing in our city. So it's 5 minutes, her description of how we can become entangled in our city for the good of the city. Have a look. We're doing these sermon series about wisdom, and I wonder if there are any points of wisdom, whether from the Proverbs or from Jesus, that you like to keep in mind or that Kingdom Causes keeps in mind for your work in helping the city flourish.
Matthew 6, the entire chapter really has been a grounding source of wisdom, I would say, for me personally and for Kingdom Causes. The way that we really grew besides just working out of the garage of Ryan Burwise in, the early 2000s, was a group of people from different churches. It might even been a couple people here at Bell One. We would meet every morning and pray through the Lord's Prayer. Because sometimes, we could have all these fancy prayers, but there has to be some wisdom in praying what Jesus told us to pray. So we would go through that every morning, and line by line, we would pause and either in silence kind of pray, or if God put something on our heart, we would pray out within that specific line. And the one that really resonates as we're seeking wisdom for Bellflower was that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done here on earth. And then we would say also, especially in Bellflower, as it is in heaven. And when you look up what the word kingdom is, not a biblical scholar, but it's shalom, in which that there's a lot of words that are used for shalom. It's wholeness, it's justice, it's peace. And so we would think through what would it look like for God's kingdom, for his peace and wholeness and justice to be here in Bellflower. And then we would pray about that. And then that kind of served as a launching point for us saying, okay, let's pray about it, but then what can we do? Because we actually have a lot of resources and a lot of influence. So how can we be an answer to that prayer, at least part of it, while we're asking God to work on behalf of us? Yeah. So Bellflower is blessed with a lot of nonprofits that are doing amazing work here, besides Kingdom Causes. Just to let you guys know a little bit more of what Kingdom Causes is doing, especially in 2016, and some opportunities to get involved. The first thing is Margaret's House. It's our hospitality home for homeless families. In our area, if you are a homeless family, there is not very many resources. And if depending on the age and gender of your kids, you're split up into multiple shelters. And that's almost impossible to keep your kids in school and to keep things regular for them. So Margaret's House is a very small program, but it is the only thing that our local Bellflower families have as a safety net. And so that is one way, if you want to learn more about that, or if you want to donate, that is a very crucial program for our city. We're also looking for mentors to walk along some of the families. Sometimes it's their first time having some stability, and so they're also needing to work on parenting and on life skills. And so there's room to get involved with that. The second area is working in employment. We have Good Soil Industries. We mow your lawn. And I don't know if you know much about them, but they are men who probably have a record or have been homeless in the past, and nobody would hire them. And we hire them. We work with them. We work on their resume, and we put them to work. And what our tagline is we're helping men work their way out of poverty. So these are not the kind of guys that are looking for a handout. They're wanting to work hard and work their way out so they can support their families and be reunited. And mowing people's lawns is a way for us to provide jobs for them. So we're also looking for mentors, men of faith, to walk alongside some of those new participants, because for some of them this is the first job they've ever had, or that they've had in a very long time. And so we're working on the job side, but we need men to come alongside and say, okay, this is how you do the family thing, or this is how life works, and sit down and spend time with them and build those relationships. Mm-hmm. And then we also need employers to hire them when they're done with our program. Take a risk on them. We won't vouch for somebody unless we truly believe that they're going to do well. So if you're an employer, then consider hiring one of our guys if you have an opening coming up. Mm-hmm. So those are the two main things besides just the general homeless outreach that we're working on. There's another organization in Bellflower called Olive Crest, and they work in foster care and with vulnerable families and children. And that's another organization. If your cause is for children, then you don't need to go through Kingdom Causes. Go straight to them, because they're an amazing organization, and they're looking for families and churches to help support kids that are on the fringe of going into the foster care system. So there's opportunities, whether you want to actually take somebody in or just support a family who is taking somebody in. There is so many opportunities there at Olive Crest. I think that's the great thing in Bellflower, that if there's a cause that's close to your heart, I could probably tell you an organization in here that's doing it, and I'd be happy to connect you guys to that.
So if you would like to become entangled in our city in a way that blesses the city for the good of the city, let me know, and we will get connected about that with Chrissy or with some other organization.